You're staring down retirement, but the numbers still feel fuzzy, and you've run the numbers and crunched the spreadsheets, yet you're still not sure if spending 15,000 a month is sustainable or even realistic. And without real clarity, retiring feels less like a milestone you should be celebrating and more like a gamble that stresses you out. So this video walks you through the same income strategy we've built for couples just like you so you can retire with confidence, knowing how much you can spend and why the plan works. Because the goal isn't just to retire, it's to enjoy it without second guessing every withdrawal. You've worked 40 years to earn freedom, so why does retirement suddenly feel restrictive? Why are so many people afraid to spend the money they spent decades saving? But let me show you what I mean. We worked with a couple who previously delayed their travel plans, skipped a kitchen renovation, and they were hesitant to visit their grandkids more than once a year because they were scared of running out, even though they had a very healthy nest egg saved. So the issue wasn't the math. It was that the traditional approach they were sold had zero roadmap for how to actually enjoy what they built. Most retirement advice is designed to get you to the top of the mountain, right? Max out your 401k, save consistently, hit your number. But almost no one teaches you how to come down the mountain, how to spend that money confidently and tax efficiently and in a way that actually supports your life. Because emotionally, you go from 40 years of don't touch it to suddenly needing to withdraw every single month. And it creates this mental gridlock that honestly spreadsheets alone cannot fix. So at first glance, 15,000 a month sounds impossible, like something only people with 5 million can pull off. But is it? See, Dan and Helen are both 62 and they want to retire now and keep spending 15,000 a month after taxes like they did when they were working. So naturally the question most people ask is, how much did they need saved? See, traditional advice says 15,000 a month means 180,000 a year. And using the 4% rule, you need 4.5 million. Most people stop there. I don't have that, they think, and they just assume it's out of reach or they push retirement back. But that math skips two questions that matter most. Number one, what other income sources will you have? And number two, what expenses will go away? Because when you ask those two questions, everything changes. But let's quickly unpack each one. So first, what other income sources will you have? Well, for most people, Social Security plays a major role. Some people have pensions, rental income, or part-time work. And secondarily, what expenses will go away? So some expenses like mortgages will eventually disappear, and other things like payroll taxes and retirement contributions, those vanish the moment you stop working. That alone can free up thousands each month. Now, let's see how this plays out for Dan and Helen. In Dan and Helen's case, they'll eventually receive $3,800 a month from Dan's Social Security, plus another $1,900 from Helen's Social Security. That's $5,700 a month in income that is not portfolio dependent. And 10 years into retirement, their $2,500 a month mortgage ends. That's a huge fixed cost gone. So the full $15,000 a month drawdown, well, that's not permanent. Their true portfolio need eventually drops to just $6,800 a month or about $82,000 a year, which means instead of needing 4.5 million, maybe they only need 2 million. It's the same 4% rule, but an entirely different conclusion. And that's why clarity comes from the structure of the plan, not just a one-time number. So now the question becomes, how do you actually build this out in a way that gives you real confidence? Because having a sizable portfolio means nothing if you don't know how to use it right. Most retirement plans stop the moment you hit your savings goal, but that's exactly when the real questions begin. Confidence in retirement doesn't come from hitting a number. It comes from knowing how to spend what you've saved in a way that fits your timeline, your tax picture, and your lifestyle. In other words, your portfolio isn't the plan. It's just a tool to help you live the plan with confidence and freedom. So let's put this all together. Dan and Helen have 3.4 million saved. 2.4 million is in tax deferred accounts like IRAs, and $1 million is in a taxable brokerage account. Now, remember earlier when we used the 4% rule, it suggested needing 4.5 million to support a $15,000 a month lifestyle. Well, Dan and Helen have 3.4 million, about 1.1 million less than the target. But because of how we structure their income and withdrawals, they could actually start retirement spending at 17,300 a month, not 15,000. So how's that possible? It comes down to smart withdrawal sequencing. See, early on, their portfolio carries more of the load. Their taxable account gives them flexible dollars to draw from first, then Social Security kicks in, and then the mortgage expense disappears. All that reduces what they need from their portfolio over time. So yes, that 17,300 a month equals 210,000 a year, And if you're quick with math and you look at their portfolio withdrawals, you'll see it's roughly 6.1% of a withdrawal rate in the early years. Now, to most people, this sounds aggressive, especially when you consider the 4% rule and potential sequence of return risk. But let's walk through why it works. When they retire, we will begin Helen's Social Security benefit. That's the smaller of their two benefits. Now, in 2030, Dan's Social Security benefits start, and that increases their guaranteed income significantly. And at that time, Helen receives a spousal benefit boost. Then in 2036, their $2,500 a month mortgage drops off, lowering their expenses dramatically. So while the withdrawal rate starts at 6.1%, that number declines as guaranteed income rises and fixed expenses fall. This isn't guesswork, it's a real plan built around their actual timeline and tax profile. And if you're thinking, that's exactly what I want, well, click the link in the description below and you can see if our firm might be a good fit to help you retire with the same level of clarity and confidence. So now that we've seen the structure, how do we know that $210,000 will hold up? Well, it comes down to how we manage withdrawals. Not just the starting number, but Dan and Helen aren't following the rigid 4% rule. They're using a dynamic withdrawal strategy. That means the plan doesn't just set one rate and hope it works. It monitors their portfolio every year. It makes small, smart adjustments based on how markets perform and how their life evolves. So if we look at this chart from Income Lab, it tracks safe withdrawal rates through history. And what you'll see is that they're almost never below 5%, even in some pretty tough decades. So the infamous 4% rule, it was built around the worst case scenario, retiring in the mid-1960s right before a terrible stretch of high inflation and weak returns. But let's say you retired in 1986. You could have safely started with a 4.3% withdrawal rate, and as markets outperformed, that plan would have tapped you on the shoulder and said, hey, you can keep increasing spending throughout retirement. And over time, your income could have grown significantly, but most importantly, safely. And that right there is the power of a plan that adjusts. So for Dan and Helen, 6.1% isn't scary because the plan flexes with them. When markets are strong, they can increase income, and if markets dip, they have buffers in place to scale back without panic. It's not about finding the perfect static set it and forget it withdrawal rate. It's about having a system that lets you respond to real life and still stay on track. But understanding the withdrawal strategy is just one piece, because what about the investments themselves that actually fund these withdrawals? See, Dan and Helen's portfolio doesn't just need to provide income, it has to grow with them as well. It needs to outpace inflation, and it needs to stay resilient even when the market drops. This is where most people fall into the rule of thumb trap. You probably heard the 60-40 portfolio or the 50-50 if you're feeling cautious. And these allocations get tossed around like universal solutions, but that's not real planning. A smart retirement strategy isn't about plugging your age into a risk score. It's about building a portfolio around your goals, your tax profile, and your income timeline. If someone handed Dan and Helen a cookie-cutter 60-40 portfolio, it wouldn't account for their large tax-deferred balance. It wouldn't reflect their upcoming mortgage drop-off, and it wouldn't align their taxable account with near-term spending. But here's the reality. The portfolio that gets you to retirement might not be the one that carries you through it. So what does this look like in practice for Dan and Helen? Well, first, for them, we carved out about 4 years worth of income and spending into more stable, lower volatility investments like high quality bonds and cash. That gives them breathing room so they don't need to sell growth assets, not if, but when the markets drop. And second, we diversify globally because even though the US markets have done incredibly well recently, history shows that leadership rotates. In the 2000s, the S&P 500 was one of the worst performing major indexes. If all your money was there, your income could have been cut dramatically. See, diversification isn't about chasing returns, it's about reducing reliance on any single market or outcome and taking the guesswork out of staying retired. But what if the market crashes the moment Dan and Helen retire? So let's stress test their plan against one of the worst economic periods in recent history, the Great Financial Crisis. Between 2007 and 2009, U.S. stocks lost around half their value. Unemployment hit 10% and stayed high for many years. It was brutal. And let's say Dan and Helen retire into that exact scenario with a 75-25 portfolio mix and start spending $17,300 a month. Here's what happens. The blue bar on screen represents their planned income. The blue line is their actual income over time, adjusted dynamically based on portfolio performance. And what you'll notice is it stays surprisingly close to their original plan, even in the depths of a 50% market drop. Their spending doesn't crash. Yes, it does get tight and the portfolio nears the lower guardrail, but it never crosses it. No income cuts were required. And that's the power of a dynamic withdrawal strategy, not a static 4% rule or hope it works out plan, but real responsive planning. And here's what's even more powerful. When we test this historically, we see that Dan and Helen's income would have increased on average by 6% every 2 years. And every 10 years, the average income decrease was only 3%. That's the difference between probability of success and what we call probability of adjustment. Because let's face it, the markets will throw curveballs. But with the right system in place, those curveballs don't have to derail your life. They just trigger small, manageable adjustments. And most importantly, the long-term trajectory stays intact. When you know that even a worst-case market doesn't force you to cut spending, that's real confidence. And this is the part almost no one talks about. The most important thing in retirement isn't your asset allocation or even your total balance. It's your ability to make small, smart adjustments before things get off track. And that's what gives you flexibility. That's what lets you retire earlier. And that's what gives you confidence, not just to survive retirement, but to actually enjoy it. It's not about picking the perfect withdrawal rate or guessing the market. It's about building a system that adjusts as you go so that when the market dips or inflation spikes or life throws you a curveball, there's no panic. The plan already accounts for it. And for Dan and Helen, that's the difference between hoping they can spend $15,000 and confidently starting at $17,300 with margin to adjust. That's what lets some couples retire at 62 instead of waiting until 67 just to be safe. You don't need to wait for perfect. You need a plan that's built for real life with all its ups, downs, and everything in between. So the next time someone says you need 3 million to retire, I want you to remember this. It's not about hitting a number. It's about building a strategy. One that gives you confidence to spend, not 10 years from now, but today. Because when you understand how to build the right income strategy, and when you align your investments to your real life timeline, and when you stay flexible even though markets are uncertain, that's when retirement stops feeling like a gamble and starts feeling real. And if you want this done for your situation, not back of the napkin math, but a real plan with your numbers, visit the link in the description below. We can explore if we're the right fit for you to retire confidently and enjoy what you've worked so hard for. Because you didn't save for 40 years just to wonder, can I afford this? You save so that you could live, travel more, give more generously, and say yes to what matters. That's how you maximize your return on life. Now, you just saw how Dan and Helen could start confidently spending $17,300 a month despite starting above the 4% rule because they had a dynamic, adaptable income plan. But what if you don't have a plan like that yet and want to know which withdrawal method actually gives you the most flexibility and peace of mind? Watch this next video to compare the 4% rule, Vanguard's method, and the advanced strategy that could help you spend more in retirement without running out. My business partner, Anthony, will see you over in that video right now.